things that people get wrong, and I'm very empathetic and understanding of how this comes about, use or optimal and suboptimal testosterone levels, is vices. The less coffee you drink and the earlier you have it in the day, the better you're going to sleep. We don't see the same health benefits of coffee drinkers when they drink coffee all day. It's time to change that habit if you want to feel like the best version of yourself. This is an inevitable path that you will ultimately need to go. Caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, and cannabis. Sounds like a good Friday night. At a more macro level, when it comes to optimizing men's health with hormone replacement therapy, when guys walk into the TRT clinic or have their first telemedicine call with whoever they've trusted to hijack their endocrine system and hopefully optimize their quality of life, a lot of the time they'll think that it's just a matter of take the right dose of testosterone, and if they get a bit more nuanced with it and take the right injection frequency or have the right route of application, and as long as they nail that, they'll feel fantastic. They'll feel like Superman meets King Kong, wake up every morning with a rock hard erection and go straight to the gym, hopefully after the erection goes away, and be completely mentally on fire all day, every day, come home, sleep like a baby, and repeat 7 days a week. Tell you what, if it worked like that, my job would be a hell of a lot easier. It doesn't. Spoiler. And one of the reasons that people have their expectations fall short is that, one, the expectations are absurd. The problem is that people are not living like healthy men. And when you take a healthy man's testosterone level and inject it into an unhealthy man, well, it's like if you took someone who didn't know how to drive and put them behind the wheel of a Lamborghini. They're not going to become a sports driver, and it's probably not going to work out very well. One of the things that people get wrong, and I'm very empathetic and understanding of how this comes about, one of my primary interests is neuropsychiatry and behavioral psychology, particularly around androgen use or optimal and suboptimal testosterone levels, is vices. And a lot of people have vices from their hypogonadal period of their life. They felt like shit, so they did something that makes them feel better in the short term, because the long term doesn't really matter when you feel like crap today. You're just trying to get through, and that makes sense because humans are humans. But there comes a time where we have to take a step back and realize that the things that got us to where we needed help might not be the same things that get us to being the best versions of ourselves. Maybe. Probably. And it can be difficult for guys to take a step away from their vices. It can be difficult to let go of the things that aren't serving you, especially if you're someone who maybe wants to have your cake and eat it too, or maybe you even feel entitled to have your cake and eat it too. These are the hard guys to work with. The hardest guys to work with are the guys who expect to feel like the mega King Kong porn star professional athlete, but also want to drink a few shots of Jack Daniels or a few beers every night. That's not going to happen. I can guarantee that. So I think it's important to have a discussion around how these vices work, and maybe if there could be room for any of these vices in a way that might not be perfect, but might be close enough that people can find a happy medium, because some people just really like to have a glass of wine, or they really like to have a cocktail, or they really like a craft beer, or they really like a little bit of cannabis here and there. Or, if you're like me, you really like a good espresso coffee. So, I want to go through these big four. I wish it was a big five because that sounds cooler, but we're going to go with big four. And I'm going to give you my take on all of them. I've researched these a lot. I've seen how they've played out even more. And all of my recommendations are going to come from a cross-section of what the literature says, but most importantly, what comes up in practice, because I may not be a doctor, but I am definitely a health coach, and this is a health coaching thing, so this is my field. So I'm going to start with caffeine. The healthiest way to consume caffeine is from naturally occurring sources. Now, before anyone starts to scream this appeal to nature fallacy nonsense, there is some method to this madness. Is that things that occur together naturally sometimes for a reason. For example, orange juice, if it's minimally processed at least, it will, regardless of processing, it's full of sugar. But it's also high in vitamin C. And lo and behold, vitamin C offsets some of the oxidative effects of sugar metabolism in the body. Wow, isn't that convenient? Sea salt is very high in sodium, but it's also very high in other trace minerals that buffer the effects of sodium in the body. Huh, that's pretty cool. Coffee is very high in caffeine, that's why we like it. but it's also incredibly rich in antioxidants, polyphenols, flavonoids. It's very high in magnesium, which is what caffeine depletes, almost like it's meant to be. So when you isolate these things, when you take out the caffeine or when you take out the sodium or you take out the sugar, and you remove the other stuff that comes with it in nature, maybe that creates a bit of a problem. And maybe the problem that it creates isn't catastrophic in the short term, but maybe prolonged, consistent, high-dose use of it in the long term could lead to some problems. I think that's pretty reasonable. One of the problems with caffeine is that the products that are on the market these days are absurd. When I was growing up back in my day, and I'm not that old, I remember when Red Bull first hit the market, and that was like crazy. 250 ml can of Red Bull, you know, the little one, 80 milligrams of caffeine, mental. Now that's basically child's play. When I came to the States recently, you guys had 300 milligram cans of energy drinks. That's not. Pre-workouts often have 300 milligrams of caffeine in them. That's not. Especially if you're having that after having your Monster Energy drink and after having your morning cup of coffee. I find it's very common for guys these days to be consuming either close to or sometimes even upwards of a gram of caffeine a day. This is mental. The studies are pretty clear on what effect of caffeine is beneficial and what effect of caffeine is detrimental in terms of carries at least some drawbacks. And some of the studies look purely at like a 1 rep max or a very specific form of exercise performance. But I think given the fact that most people listening to this are probably not wondering about how to utilize caffeine to improve their 1 rep max on bench, we're more likely looking at, well, how much caffeine can I consume in a day for me to ideally get some of these cool health promoting benefits that I've read about in coffee, but not drive up my blood pressure or mess with my sleep? And the research shows that genetically there's 3 types of caffeine metabolizers: slow, medium, and fast. Fast metabolizers are the people who can have the espresso or the affogato after dinner and go to bed 2 hours later. They're actually pretty rare. Most commonly, people are slow or moderate metabolizers of caffeine. And what we find in the research is that dosages above anywhere from 150 to 300 milligrams a day produce negative effects on hypertension, high blood pressure. Whereas the fast metabolizers, depending on the individual, can tolerate 300 to 500 milligrams of caffeine per day. So the standard shot of espresso has about 80 milligrams of caffeine, and to preserve the most nutrients possible from the caffeine, including the magnesium, from the coffee bean, it's best to have it in an espresso, not Nespresso, espresso form of coffee. Now, other forms of coffee are not bad, it's just that espresso is better. And ideally, you want to have some fresh organic beans that you grind yourself to make a high quality, healthy, organic cup of coffee. Now, I think that we should, if we're wanting to get caffeine from the healthiest source possible, we should get it from coffee. I think it's a little bit naive when people assume that you can take the health benefits of coffee and apply that to Monster Energy drink or pre-workouts, because what is likely occurring is what we call the entourage effect, which I'm going to cover later with cannabis, of the caffeine and all the other amazing antioxidant and polyphenol nutrients that you get from drinking coffee itself. So I think that the best thing that you can do with coffee is limit yourself to 2 to 4 shots of espresso per day. Some people can tolerate a little bit more. Some people maybe even 1 to 2 shots of espresso per day. And cut it off about 8 to 10 hours before you go to bed. Simple.
If you've just started TRT, it is completely normal to feel overwhelmed and confused. There's a lot of new territory to cover, and there is a lot of conflicting information. I wrote TRT 101 so that you can have everything that you need to know in an instruction manual in one place that you can refer back to, that you can have all the questions answered before they even come up. TRT 101 is my best practice approach for TRT from start to finish, and it contains everything that you need to avoid all the challenges and pitfalls that I've seen come up in my clients over the last 5 years. You can check it out via the link below.
Now, if you're pushing more than that, it may be because when you were feeling terrible, when you were hypogonadal, maybe before you came to Victory Men's Health and found out that you were hypothyroid as well, which is very common for people to self-medicate thyroid or even DHEA deficiencies with caffeine. You might have needed this to get by, but now you don't, so it's time to change that habit if you want to feel like the best version of yourself. The less coffee you drink and the earlier you have it in the day, the better you're going to sleep. We don't see the same health benefits of coffee drinkers when they drink coffee all day. We mainly see the health benefits in the people who drink coffee in the morning only. Makes sense. Coffee good for you, but sleep also good. The next one I'd like to talk about is alcohol. And alcohol, I'm going to try not to get triggered because I'm in control of my emotions. But if one thing is going to trigger me in this space, it's alcohol. And alcohol is a poison. It's a toxin. It's a poison to every system in the body. And it gives you a nice, but also kind of toxic feeling buzz. It's a bit dopaminergic. It works on the GABA system. It kind of picks you up and puts you down at the same time. And for the sake of social lubrication, sometimes that can subjectively be quite nice. Sometimes it comes in a nice tasting cocktail or something like that as well. But alcohol is one of the most difficult things to work with as a health coach because the people who drink often won't stop drinking until it becomes a real problem. And the difficulty is that people are wanting to be the optimal best versions of themselves, but they also want to have a couple of drinks every night. You can't do this. Doesn't work. One or the other. Pick one. I know which one I'd pick. Now, I think that zero alcohol is the best. And I think most people are going to agree with me on that. But there are some people who really insist on keeping alcohol as part of their lifestyle in moderation. And if you're going to do this, what I've found from reviewing, I don't even know how many blood tests now, thousands of blood tests with how many alcoholic drinks do you drink and how often, as a mandated question as part of my review process, I probably reviewed thousands of this. Thousands and thousands. I've reviewed more than 100 this week and it's only Wednesday. I have found that 1 to 2 standard drinks, 1 to 2 times a week at the most. Standard drink is not a glass of wine or a stubby of beer. It is one standard drink, which is equivalent to about 30 milliliters, or in freedom units, 1 ounce of a 40% proof spirit. 1 to 2 standard drinks, 1 to 2 times a week seems to be not ideal, but not overly detrimental when it comes to reviewing blood work. One of the interesting things that I've noticed is that I can take someone who is relatively metabolically healthy, eating super clean, exercising all the time, but drinking 2 to 3 standard drinks per week, and their triglycerides will often be at the same level as someone who is morbidly obese. All the other health markers look fine, but the triglycerides are completely discombobulated. It's not good. Alcohol's not good for your liver, but it's also not good for your heart. So if you want to be healthy, and if you drop the booze for a month, you'll feel so much better that this is just going to be common sense after you do that. But you can't drink all the time, and you definitely can't binge drink on the weekend and be the best version of yourself. One of the difficult conversations I have to have with people most days is that you can't drink 10, 15 standard drinks on a Friday or Saturday night and have a side effect free optimal TRT treatment. I'm smiling because it's almost funny. You can't do that. You can't binge drink every weekend of your life for decades and expect to have a happy, healthy, functional latter years of your life. You're going to find out in the tail end that it's not going to work out for you. So one of the things that I find very interesting working with men in their 50s and 60s is the alcohol consumption over a lifetime is often a big variable in how well they're doing. So consider limiting or eliminating alcohol if you want to be the best version of yourself. But if you do insist on keeping alcohol in, as long as you understand that none is better, 1 to 2 standard drinks, 1 to 2 times per week, 2 standard drinks being much better than 4 and 0 being even better than 2. This is an inevitable path that you will ultimately need to go down, and you can throw all the supplements and peptides that you want at it, but it's not going to offset for the negative effects of the booze. Trust me, I've seen people try it, it doesn't work. The next one I'd like to talk about is nicotine. Nicotine has become very trendy as of late, formerly due to vapes, and recently due to the pouches, which originate from Swedish snus and are now typically referred to as Zins in the US, or different names of nicotine pouches which don't contain tobacco. They tend to contain nicotine and then various filler agents, flavorings, and they go into a nice little lip pillow and contain anywhere from 3 milligrams of caffeine all the way up to, I've seen them go as high as 18 milligrams of caffeine, but 3, 6, 9 milligrams of nicotine tend to be more common. Now, for reference, although cigarettes contain significantly more nicotine than you absorb through inhaling it, depending on the strength of the cigarette, you tend to absorb about 1 milligram of nicotine, give or take, per cigarette. And having a 3 to 6 milligram nicotine pouch will result in most of that nicotine being absorbed over about 30 to 45 minutes, depending on how the pouch is structured. So people are consuming quite a bit of nicotine with these. Now, you're not getting the irritating effects on the lungs. Potentially, you are going to get some irritating effects on the gums. This hasn't really been looked at. And for people who are going to use these, I recommend using, again, I don't recommend using them at all, but if you are going to use them, use ones that at least use natural pouches and natural fillers. There is a brand called Coco, which I think is probably the best on the market, but I'm far from an expert with these. People need to be really conscious of the amount of nicotine they're consuming. Nicotine is actually good for you, believe it or not. It's not the stuff in cigarettes that's bad for you. It's one of the things in cigarettes that's addictive, but it's the thing that makes you feel good when you have the cigarette, but it's not the thing that causes cancer. Now, when it comes to nicotine itself, as I said, it's good for you, but it's about the dose. And excessive doses of nicotine are not good for you because they increase blood pressure, they increase stimulation in the body, which in a small amount can be beneficial, but in large amounts can overstimulate the central nervous system, dysregulate the balance between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, and can put you in a state of chronic fight or flight. So I was actually put onto nicotine almost 2 decades ago now by a friend of mine who is and I believe he still is, a surgeon. And he told me that he loves using nicotine before a surgery at a microdose because caffeine produces a mild tremor, whereas nicotine didn't. But he was using a 1 milligram dose of nicotine. And I think if people want to use nicotine, getting it in a microdose version and using it on non-consecutive days as a cognitive enhancing agent can be a great health promoting nootropic. But using 3 or 6 milligram pouches of Zyn or alternatives regularly multiple times per day is 1, going to lead to tolerance, 2, going to lead to addiction, and 3, going to lead to more side effects and less benefits. You're basically going to end up at a point where you're just using these products to feel normal, and when you don't use them, you don't feel as good. So if you want to benefit from nicotine, use it on non-consecutive days in doses of 1 milligram or below in the cleanest form you possibly can. Now, the last one I'm going to speak about is cannabis. And I've said it many times in podcasts. I'm a big fan of cannabis, but I don't use cannabis. And the reason why I'm a big fan of it and don't use it is, unfortunately, it's not good for you. If it was good for you, I'd probably be using it right now because I love it, but I don't use it. Cannabis is my vice of choice. And one of the reasons that I love living in the country that I live in is that cannabis is completely illegal and unavailable. So it makes that decision very easy. Cannabis, people argue about what kind of drug is cannabis. And technically, cannabis, primarily THC, is a psychedelic. Now, depending on how much of it you have, it might be more or less psychedelic, but if we're going to put it into a class of drugs, it's a psychedelic. Some people would argue it's a dissociative. I'd argue that it's the opposite of a dissociative. But it has some relaxing properties. It has some stimulating properties. THC has some wonderful health-promoting anti-inflammatory properties. But it's also very psychoactive. And the body actually has a system called the endocannabinoid system, short for endogenous cannabinoid system. Endogenous meaning internally produced. And the body is primarily running on a endocannabinoid called anandamide. And when you take in exogenous, meaning external cannabis such as THC, this anandamide production becomes dysregulated. Kind of like when you take exogenous testosterone. So when you use cannabis frequently, you become, people say you don't get addicted to it. I disagree, but you do become biologically dependent on it. Now, what does it mean to be dependent versus addicted? I think that's kind of up for debate. But the problem that we have with cannabis, and one of the reasons why people have a bit of a hangover or a stone over after using high doses of THC, is that there are some dysregulatory effects on the endocannabinoid system, the dopaminergic system, the GABA system, the cortisol system. All of these things from using cannabis, plus it's often inhaled, meaning it is combusted, which is still inflammatory to the esophagus and the lungs. Yes, it's less bad for you than smoking cigarettes, but it doesn't mean that it's good for you. And even oral THC is still estrogenic. and it still actually dysregulates the androgen receptor, reducing the binding of a very important androgen, which I've spoken about before, called DHT. Now, I think there are some use cases, again, if people want to make room for cannabis in their life, if they really enjoy it, if they understand that none is better, but some can be okay, but not ideal. I think that THC should be limited to a once a month thing, maybe a once a fortnight thing, in a minimal effective dose. Ideally consumed orally in doses of maybe 2.5 to 5 milligrams, because there should be very little or no tolerance with this frequency. But the other thing that people use THC for, which is what I want to talk about today, is for sleep. And the problem is that if you use a high dose of THC for sleep, and some people might not even consider it high, but a couple of puffs of a joint or a couple of little hits of a bong, or half an edible or a low dose 10 milligram edible here and there, or even every night, you'll find that one, you're not having proper sleep cycles. You're trading REM sleep for deep sleep. You might notice you don't really dream very much. But two, you're going to find it more difficult to sleep on the nights that you're not using the THC. This is because the system becomes dysregulated. So if someone is in a situation where they're having trouble sleeping and they're using THC as a crutch for this, I recommend using a combination of melatonin, phosphatidylserine, which I've done a lecture on, in combination with CBD, which is the non-psychoactive but still relaxing other half of the cannabis plant. And I like to see CBD in a dose of about 1/4 to 1/2 milligram per kilogram of body weight. Phosphatidylserine, ideally in the Thorn version, which is a phosphatidylserine isolate, in 300 to 600 milligrams, and melatonin in doses of 5 milligrams all the way up to 20, 50, or even 100 milligrams if you really can't sleep. But for most people, 5 milligrams of pharmaceutical melatonin will do the job. Now, if someone has particular issues with insomnia that can't be resolved, maybe you've got chronic pain, maybe you've got some PTSD, maybe who knows? It's not my business. A microdose of THC, 1 to 2 milligrams at the very most, is likely going to be less of a net negative than something like Ambien, something like diazepam, something like trazodone, clonidine, whatever else people are using for sleep. Sedating antihistamines are even worse, but I know people are using things like Benadryl for sleep, which is terrible. It's like a chemical brick to the head. A tiny little bit of THC can often make all the difference to help people get to sleep, but if it's producing a psychoactive effect, it's too much, and it's going to dysregulate the system in the coming nights. So if cannabis is going to be used, it can't be a daily thing. It can't be something that you're getting high off regularly, and it's something that people really need to be cognizant of, that you can't get high all the time on a drug and also be healthy. You can't. Are there exceptions to these rules? Absolutely. Do exceptions disprove any of these rules? No, they're actually eliminated because they're not statistically significant. So that covers my thoughts on all these vices. The best thing that you can do, and my closing point, because I still have another 6 minutes, and I'm probably going to use, it's coming up to 5 minutes. I'm going to use all of them. I put a post up on Instagram yesterday, and if the story hadn't expired, I'd pull it up so I could read it to make sure I don't get it wrong, but it went something like this. The majority of people who come to me who have their TRT protocols dialed in but are not feeling dialed in, it's because they're not doing quite enough cardio, they're not getting quite enough steps, they're not getting quite enough sleep, and they're drinking a little bit too much alcohol and a little bit too much caffeine. And all of these things in isolation, not a big deal. Not a big deal. Not ideal, but not a big deal. But in combination, a little bit of a subpar cardiovascular system, being a little bit underslept chronically, being a little bit overcaffeinated, and having a little bit too much booze, all of these things together can mess up your blood work, can mess up your sex drive, can mess up your sexual function, can mess with your cognitive function, can mess with your recovery from exercise, your body composition. All of these things in combination can add up to a problem that people are often seeking medications for, peptides for, very elaborate supplement stacks, or coming back to their provider saying, hey, I don't feel dialed in, something's wrong. And people are often overlooking that if all of these things are a little bit off, in combination, that can be the root cause thing. But people often don't want to look at that. People often don't want to do the work. Vices are vices. And people will often gravitate to one or the other based off preference. And part of maturing, part of self-development, part of transcending into the person that you could be and further away from the person that you were when you came to seek help in the first place is moving on from the vices that are no longer serving you and experiencing the world and experiencing self and experiencing self-development in a way that is uninhibited, unsupported, and 100% authentically you. So I hope that helps, and I'll see you guys on the next one.
What we're going to be going through today is the basics. And I think it's very important to revisit the basics periodically, because if we look back 5 years ago and even 10 years ago, what was considered best practice then may not be considered, and from 10 years ago definitely is not considered best practice now. A lot of the content that I make is talking about more high-level troubleshooting cases, but most people, actually I would argue everyone, at one point or